Most people today experience hardship as an interruption. A bad week, a rough year, something that arrives, causes problems, and is then hopefully resolved with time, effort, or a customer support chat. Medieval peasants did not think this way. For them, hardship was not an event. It was the background setting. Life was not about progress or improvement. It was about continuity, about keeping things from getting worse. You were born into a routine that already existed. You learned it slowly. You repeated it carefully. And then one day you stopped. This is not a story about kings or wars or great moments. It is about the quiet persistence of ordinary people who woke up, worked until tired, and went to sleep knowing tomorrow would look almost exactly the same. If you enjoy slow history like this, you might consider subscribing. And if you're listening late at night, feel free to leave a comment with your city and the time you're listening from. It's always interesting to see how far these quiet stories travel. Chapter 1. Waking up where you did not choose to be. Before we go any further, it helps to get comfortable. This is not a story that rushes. It doesn't reward alertness. It moves at the pace of a candle slowly shrinking. So settle in wherever you are. Let the room stay dim. Let the outside world do whatever it's doing without you. Medieval life will wait. It always did. A medieval peasant did not wake up to an alarm. There was no sharp noise telling them it was time to start the day. Instead, waking happened gradually. Light crept in through gaps in wood and thatch. Cold made itself known first, usually through the feet. The body woke before the mind did. This was normal. Beds, if they existed at all, were simple frames or piles of straw. Often they were shared, sometimes with family, sometimes with animals. Not out of affection, out of necessity. The idea of personal space was vague. Privacy was not a concept with clear edges. You lived where you worked. You slept where you lived. Everything overlapped. The house, if it could be called that, was usually a single room. Smoke lingered from the previous night's fire. It never fully left. It just thinned out enough to be tolerated. Getting out of bed was not optional. There was no weekend coming. No day off to look forward to. The calendar was not a personal tool. It belonged to the church, the Lord, and the land itself. Seasons mattered more than dates. And mourning mattered because work waited, patiently and endlessly. Clothing was already nearby because there was nowhere else to put it. The same tunic, the same rough fabric. Repairs done poorly but repeatedly. Clothing was valuable. You owned very little of it. What you had needed to last. Fashion was not a concern. Warmth was. Durability was. Looking exactly like everyone else was normal. Breakfast was not a distinct event. It was food if food existed. Often it was bread. Dark bread, heavy bread. Bread that had been baked days ago and was slowly hardening into something that required commitment to chew. Sometimes there was porridge. Grain boiled until it surrendered. Flavor was minimal. That was fine. Expectation was minimal too. And while that quietly carried on, the village itself was waking up in the same way. Doors opened slowly. Animals made noise because they always did. Someone coughed. Someone else complained about the cold, even though it was the same cold as yesterday. Nothing about this was new. A medieval peasant did not think of themselves as poor in a modern sense. This was simply life. Everyone around them lived this way. Comparison did not reach very far. You knew the Lord lived differently, of course. You had seen the manner. You understood the difference. But it was distant. Abstract. Like weather you couldn't control. Work began early because daylight was valuable. There was no artificial lighting worth relying on. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps required oil. The sun did the job for free, and so you used it while you could. Most peasants worked the land, but that phrase hides a lot of detail. Working the land meant constant attention. Soil needed turning. Weeds needed pulling. Animals needed watching. Fences needed repairing. Tools needed fixing. Everything was always slightly broken. Tools were simple. Wooden handles. Metal tips, if you were lucky. They wore down. Correct. When something broke, you did not replace it easily. You fixed it. Again and again. A good tool was something you might use for decades. It aged with you. The fields themselves were not owned by the people working them. That was an important detail that shaped everything else. You worked land that belonged to someone else. In exchange, you kept a portion of what grew. Another portion went to the Lord. Another portion went to the church. The math was not generous. Taxes were not discussed politely. They were obligations. Rents, tithes, labor days. Some paid in grain. Some paid in time. Some paid in both. Records were kept. Someone always remembered what you owed. And yet, the system functioned. It had existed long before you were born. It would exist after you were gone. Individual suffering was not a concern. Stability was. As the morning went on, the body warmed through movement. Muscles loosened because they had no choice. Pain was familiar, a constant low-level presence. Backs hurt. Knees complained. Hands were rough and often injured. Small cuts were common. Healing was slow. There was no concept of ergonomics. Work was done the way it had always been done. If it hurt, that was unfortunate but expected. Complaining did not change anything. Children worked too, as soon as they were able. There was no sharp line between childhood and adulthood. Skills were learned by watching and copying. Education was practical. If you could carry water, you carried water. If you could scare birds away from crops, you did that. Idleness was discouraged. Midday brought a pause not because of labor laws, but because the body required fuel. Meals were repetitive. Stews were common because they made limited ingredients stretch. Vegetables, grains, maybe a bit of fat if available. Meat was rare. When it appeared, it was memorable. Eating was quiet, not ceremonial. People ate because they needed to keep going. Conversation, if it happened, was about practical things. Weather, crops, someone's animal behaving strangely. News traveled slowly and was often unreliable. And while that quietly carried on, time moved forward without announcement. There were no clocks marking the hours. Bells from the church helped, but even they were vague. Life flowed according to light and fatigue. The afternoon looked much like the morning. More work, slightly heavier limbs. The same field, the same motions. Repetition was the defining feature of peasant life. It was not boring in a modern sense. It was absorbing. There was always something that needed attention. Occasionally, something broke the routine. A holy day, a festival, a visit from an official. These moments stood out not because they were joyful, but because they were different. The rest of the time, sameness was reassuring. As daylight faded, work slowed. Not because it was finished, but because it could no longer be seen properly. Evening meant tending the fire, feeding animals, closing doors that were more symbolic than secure. Dinner was similar to earlier meals. Whatever remained, nothing wasted. Leftovers folded back into the next day. Food was a cycle, not an event. Night brought darkness quickly. The house filled with shadow. The fire dimmed. Conversation slowed. Stories were told sometimes. Familiar ones. Stories that didn't require attention. Sleep arrived not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Chapter 2. Learning your place slowly and thoroughly. A medieval peasant did not need to be told where they stood in the world. That information arrived gradually, through experience, repetition, and correction. You learned it the same way you learned everything else. By doing something slightly wrong and being reminded, calmly or otherwise, that it was not your decision to make. Hierarchy was not theoretical. It was practical. It determined where you walked, how you spoke, and when you stayed quiet. You did not debate it. You navigated it. Like a familiar path with uneven stones, you learned where to step and where not to linger. Most peasants were born into families already attached to a particular village. This was not a coincidence. Movement was limited. Travel required permission, resources, and a reason good enough to be accepted by someone with authority. Simply wanting to go somewhere else was not sufficient. Serfdom, where it existed, made this official. You were legally tied to the land. Not metaphorically, literally. Leaving without permission could result in punishment or retrieval or both. Freedom, in this sense, was not about ambition. It was about paperwork you would never see. Even peasants who were technically free still lived within narrow boundaries. Land ownership was rare. Tools were shared or borrowed. Credit existed in informal ways, usually involving promises, favors, and long memories. Everyone knew who owed whom. No one forgot. The village itself functioned as a small, closed system. People depended on one another whether they liked it or not. Cooperation was not a moral choice. It was survival. If your neighbor's roof collapsed, you helped fix it. Not out of kindness, but because next time it might be yours. Social roles were stable. They changed slowly, if at all. The blacksmith did not suddenly become a baker. The baker did not decide to take up weaving. Skills were passed down through families. Occupations were inherited as often as names. Some jobs were more visible than others. The plowman spent long hours in the fields. The shepherd followed animals across familiar routes. The miller worked near the mill and was quietly resented by everyone, mostly because he controlled access to an essential service and charged for it. This resentment was traditional. Women's labor was constant and varied. They worked the fields, managed households, prepared food, cared for children, and handled tasks that were never officially listed but always required. Their work did not end earlier or begin later. It simply filled every available gap. Marriage was less about romance and more about logistics. It joined families, labor, and resources. Choice existed, sometimes. Often it didn't. Age gaps were common. Expectations were clear. You built a household because that was what adults did. Children arrived frequently. Not all of them stayed. This was understood quietly. Loss was part of life, acknowledged briefly and then folded into routine. There was work to do. Grief did not stop the seasons. Religion shaped time and behavior without demanding constant attention. Church bells marked days. Holy days interrupted work. Confession offered structure more than comfort. Faith was practical. It explained why things were the way they were. It promised order, if not improvement. Sundays provided rest, but not leisure in a modern sense. You did not lie around doing nothing. You simply worked differently. More social interaction, more observation, less physical strain, sometimes. The church also acted as a record keeper. Births, marriages, deaths. These events mattered because they changed obligations. Who what? Who inherited which tools? Who could claim which strip of land? And while that quietly carried on, authority remained present but distant. The Lord was not usually seen. His influence arrived through stewards, officials, and occasional visits. Rules were enforced unevenly. Justice was inconsistent. This was normal. Chapter 4. Eating whatever the year allowed. Food in a medieval peasant's life was not a source of excitement. It was a calculation. A quiet, ongoing assessment of what was available, what needed to be saved, and what could be eaten now without causing a problem later. Hunger was not dramatic. It was familiar. It arrived gradually and stayed at manageable levels most of the time. The foundation of the diet was grain. This was not a preference. It was a consequence of climate, technology, and efficiency. Grain could be grown in bulk. It could be stored. It could be turned into many things that all tasted roughly similar. Bread, porridge, gruel. Different forms, same idea. Bread was not soft. It was dense and dark, made from whatever grain was available. Rye, barley, wheat if you were fortunate or privileged. The flour was coarse. Bits of husk remained. Sometimes small stones did too. Teeth wore down accordingly. Baking was not a daily activity. Ovens were communal. Dough was prepared in advance and baked when possible. Bread aged quickly. Stale bread was normal. Fresh bread was a brief phase that passed quietly. When bread became too hard, it was repurposed. Soaked in liquid. Crumbled into soups. Nothing was thrown away. Waste was not immoral. It was impractical. Porridge filled the gaps. Grain boiled in water or milk when milk existed. It was warm. It was filling. Flavor came from salt, if salt was available. Sometimes herbs. Sometimes nothing at all. Vegetables provided variation, though not abundance. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans. These were grown close to the house in small plots. They were reliable. They did not demand much attention once established. Roots stored well. Turnips, carrots. They lasted through winter if conditions were right. This mattered. Winter meals were quieter, more repetitive, and carefully rationed. Meat existed, but it was not central. Animals were valuable alive. They produced milk, wheat labor. Killing them was a serious decision. Meat appeared on special occasions, or when an animal died unexpectedly and needed to be used quickly. When meat was eaten, it was stretched, added to stews, boiled down, shared among many people. No one expected a large portion. Fish was more common in some regions, especially near rivers or coasts. Religious fasting days increased its importance. Fish could be dried or salted, though preservation required resources. Dairy products filled nutritional gaps. Milk spoiled quickly, so it was turned into cheese or butter when possible. These products lasted longer and traveled better. Cheese was especially valuable. Portable, reliable. Eggs were seasonal. Hens did not lay year-round. When eggs were available, they were used carefully. Often saved, sometimes sold. Fruit existed, but it was not sweet in the modern sense. Apples. Much of it was eaten fresh when available and forgotten when not. Preservation through drying was possible, but limited. Honey was the primary sweetener. Sugar was rare and expensive. Honey came from careful beekeeping or opportunistic gathering. It was valued, used sparingly. Spices were not common. Flavor was subtle. Meals were not bland so much as restrained. Expectations were different. You did not anticipate variety. You anticipated adequacy. Meals were communal. Families ate together. Portions were not measured precisely. People ate until food was gone or hunger eased. There was no strict structure beyond availability. Children ate what adults ate. There was no separate cuisine. Tastes were learned early. Preferences were shaped by repetition. Alcohol was present, but mild. Ale and beer were safer than water in some places. They were brewed locally, low in alcohol, consumed daily. Drunkenness was not the goal. Hydration was. Water quality varied. Wells were shared. Streams were used carefully. Contamination was understood in practical terms, even if germ theory was not. People knew when water made them sick. They adjusted. Seasonal abundance brought temporary relief. After harvest, food felt more secure. Portions increased slightly. Spirits lifted modestly. This phase did not last long. Winter narrowed options. Stored grain, preserved vegetables, dried foods. Meals became smaller. Careful planning mattered. Running out early was dangerous. Famine was not constant, but it was remembered. Stories passed down. Years when crops failed. When food ran out. These memories shaped behavior long after conditions improved. People did not eat for pleasure. They ate for continuation. Meals marked time. Morning, midday, evening. Each one acknowledged quietly and then forgotten. Cooking methods were simple. Boiling dominated because it required less fuel and attention. Roasting was less common. Baking required access to ovens. Utensils were minimal. Spoons were common. Knives were personal tools used for many tasks. Plates were shared or non-existent. Bowls mattered. Cleanliness was relative. Dishes were rinsed. Hands were wiped. Standards were practical, not aesthetic. And while that quietly carried on, food became memory. Certain tastes associated with certain times. Harvest stew, winter porridge, festival bread. These associations were mild but persistent. Hunger sharpened awareness. People noticed when supplies dipped. Conversations adjusted. Decisions became conservative. Risk was avoided. Sharing food reinforced relationships. Refusing to share was noticed. Generosity was measured. Reputation mattered. The church influenced diet through fasting days. Meatless meals were required regularly. This was not resented. It aligned with existing scarcity. Children learned early not to waste. Scraps were collected. Bones were boiled again. Fat was saved. Nothing escaped reuse. Occasionally, something unexpected appeared. A traveler brought news and food. A successful hunt. A gift from the Lord. These moments were remembered briefly. But most days looked the same. The same pot. The same ingredients. The same motions. Eating was routine. Chapter 5. Living with illness and not making much of it. Illness was not a disruption to medieval peasant life. It was part of it. People did not ask whether they would get sick. They assumed they would. The only uncertainty was how often, how severely, and whether it would pass quietly or linger longer than expected. Most ailments were minor, though they did not feel minor at the time. Coughs that stayed for weeks. Fevers that came and went. Aches that never fully disappeared. These were tolerated rather than treated. Rest helped, but rest was limited. Work adjusted slightly, then resumed. Medical knowledge existed, but it was uneven and distant. Learned medicine belonged to cities, monasteries, and universities. Peasants relied on what was available. Herbs gathered locally. Poultices made from familiar plants. Advice passed down through families. Some remedies worked. Some did nothing. Some caused additional problems. This was not always obvious. Cause and effect were difficult to separate. If someone recovered, the treatment was credited. If they didn't, it was accepted. The body was understood as something that needed balance. Heat and cold. Wet and dry. Food choices reflected this thinking. If you felt unwell, you adjusted what you ate. More broth. Less effort. These were practical responses. By mid-childhood, responsibilities increased. Gathering firewood, tending poultry, helping with milking. Each task required awareness. Children were integrated into the rhythm of the household. They learned to wake early, move steadily, and observe the world with practical focus. Work blended with play naturally. A child chasing a chicken was learning herding techniques. Carrying a small bundle of grain helped develop strength and balance. Socialization happened through shared tasks rather than structured activity. Meals were simple. Children ate what adults ate, adjusted for quantity. Expectations were clear. Waste was discouraged. Surplus was rare. Food taught attention, patience, and resource management early. Education beyond practical skills was minimal. Some learned to read or write if the family had access to a cleric or literate neighbor. Most learned only observation, memorization, and repetition. History, stories, and lore were absorbed orally, casually, and quietly. Lessons were subtle, embedded in daily life. Health shaped childhood significantly. Illness was common. Recovery was slow. Children who survived early years gained endurance and resilience. Care was practical, warmth, nourishment, and observation. Medical intervention was limited. Herbs, poultices, and midwives provided guidance, but survival remained uncertain. Sleep patterns were inherited from adult routines. Children rose with light. Night waking was common but unremarkable. Proximity to parents provided warmth and subtle supervision. Sleep was functional. Fatigue was part of education. Seasonal variation guided activity. Summer offered outdoor work. Winter involved indoor tasks, mending, spinning, and preparation. Festivals and holy days punctuated routine but were brief. Children learned to adjust effort based on light, weather, and season. Social norms were learned through observation and repetition. Respect for elders. Awareness of obligations. Recognition of hierarchy within the household and village. Conflict resolution and negotiation occurred subtly. Children watched, listened, and imitated. Apprenticeship began informally within the household. By adolescence, children specialized in tasks suited to gender, strength, or family need. Boys learned plowing, tool repair, and animal management. Girls learned food preparation, spinning, weaving, and household management. Tasks overlapped, but specialization increased efficiency. Mistakes were corrected quietly. Learning emphasized endurance and persistence. Pride was subtle. Being able to complete a task correctly or efficiently mattered more than recognition. Self-awareness developed naturally. The passage of childhood into adolescence was unceremonious. There were no explicit rites marking maturity for most. Capability defined status. When a child could contribute meaningfully, they were treated as an adult for practical purposes. And while that quietly carried on, generational continuity was ensured. Knowledge, routines, and skills passed down naturally. Children internalized rhythm, labor, and survival strategies. Games, exploration, or leisure occurred in the margins. They existed because humans have curiosity, not because circumstances allowed indulgence. Children learned limits as much as skills. Education was holistic in the sense of life experience. Observation, participation, and repetition shaped competence. Theory was secondary. Function mattered more than imagination. By the time adulthood arrived, survival skills, endurance, and awareness were ingrained. The world was familiar. Expectations were clear. Labor was a natural extension of life. Chapter 14, The Unchanging Soundscape of Village Life. A medieval peasant's day was defined not only by work and routine, but by sound, or rather, the subtle persistence of sound that marked life quietly. It was never silent, but it was not noisy in the modern sense. Background noise existed as an unremarkable part of the environment, almost unnoticeable once you adapted to it. The crow of a rooster was predictable. It did not startle anyone. It simply marked time. Cows lowed, chickens clucked, dogs stirred. These sounds punctuated labor and daily tasks. People learned to measure effort and time against them unconsciously. The village itself added a layer of constant, low-level sound. Wooden carts creaked along rutted paths. Horses shuffled. Tools clinked, struck against stone or wood. Hammers and flails repeated steadily in the background. Nothing was urgent. Noise simply existed. Children contributed quietly. Laughter, arguments, footsteps, chatter. Play and work merged naturally. These sounds were part of the rhythm rather than distraction. Adults adjusted automatically. Attention was selective. Only sudden or threatening noises required response. The fire added its own soundscape. Crackling logs, shifting embers, occasional sparks. Cooking and heating produced warmth accompanied by subtle noise. Listening was habitual, not focused. People adjusted movements around it without thinking. Weather contributed predictably. Rain tapped roofs and windows. Wind rustled leaves and shook shutters. Snow fell silently but occasionally pressed on structures, creating groaning noises. Each was a signal as much as a sound. People learned patterns, timing, and consequences. Religious life added punctuations. Bells marked time. Calls to prayer or mass were familiar, not alarming. Music from festivals was distant and brief. Voices sang or recited scripture. These were not constant, but noticeable in context. Voices in the home were calm and practical. Conversations were quiet. Instructions, corrections, or guidance were delivered with low volume. Loud argument was rare and socially discouraged. Disputes were handled quietly, sometimes by observation, sometimes with mild intervention. Animals inside homes contributed subtly. Cows, pigs, chickens, and dogs moved, shifted, and occasionally protested. Their sounds were background, integrated into daily awareness. Adaptation occurred early. Children and adults alike learned which sounds required attention and which could be ignored. Tools produced rhythm. Hoes in soil. Flails in grain. Knives on wood. Work was audible. Fatigue and progress were measured not only by sight but by the steady cadence of activity. The sound of labor signaled success and continuity. Markets and fairs added layers occasionally. Footsteps, haggling, calling out goods. These were temporary disturbances, returning to quiet soon after. Outsiders' voices were notable only because they contrasted with the familiar low hum of village life. Silence was rare. Stillness was observed at night, when animals settled and humans rested. Even then, wind, creaking wood, and distant voices continued softly. Sleep occurred in a soundscape that was consistent, familiar, and predictable. And while that quietly carried on, people adapted their attention naturally. They did not record it, analyze it, or seek novelty. Sound was functional. It informed. It accompanied. It persisted. Through life, these patterns helped people gauge time, movement, and activity. No dramatic alarms were needed. Everything was understood in context. Rhythm and expectation guided perception. Life was continuous. Noise was unremarkable. Work, rest, and vigilance existed together in a low, persistent hum. Chapter 15: Food, Hunger, and the Slow Work of Staying Fed. The medieval peasant's relationship with food was steady, functional, and rarely indulgent. Eating was about survival, not enjoyment. Meals occurred at predictable times, in modest portions, and with the resources available rather than those desired. Hunger was a background presence, sometimes mild, sometimes sharper, but rarely dramatized. Breakfast, when it happened, was simple. Porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains, sometimes mixed with water or a bit of milk. Bread, dense and coarse, was common. A small portion of cheese or perhaps an egg appeared occasionally. People ate enough to continue labor, no more. Midday meals mirrored breakfast. They were brief and functional. Fields required attention. The body demanded energy, but not luxury. Food was calculated in volume and nutritional efficiency rather than taste. The concept of overeating was alien. You ate what you could manage, often what you could afford. Dinner, in the evening, was slightly more substantial when resources allowed. Stews, soups, and pottages combined vegetables, grains, and sometimes small portions of meat or fish. Herbs were used sparingly for flavor or preservation. Salt was valuable and used carefully. The variety was modest, often repetitive, but functional. Food was seasonal. Fresh vegetables in spring and summer. Root vegetables, dried legumes, and stored grains in winter. Preservation techniques were simple: drying, smoking, or salting when possible. Freshness was a minor luxury. Meals relied on storage and careful rationing. Hunger was experienced as mild fatigue, low energy, and occasional impatience. It did not inspire dramatics or panic under ordinary circumstances. People adjusted work, pace, and effort accordingly. Extreme shortages were rare but disruptive. Recovery was gradual. Children adapted early. They learned to eat what was available. Portions were modest. Sharing was expected. Waste was avoided. Observing adult behavior, they internalized attitudes toward food, acceptance, rationing, and patience. Special occasions brought minor variety. Festivals, religious holidays, or community gatherings allowed temporary indulgence. A sweet, a piece of meat, perhaps ale for adults. These events were noted, remembered briefly, then life returned to normal. Pleasure was subtle and fleeting. Food preparation was continuous. Grinding grain, kneading bread, tending fires. Effort went into efficiency. Meals required planning around labor demands. Cooking was practical, performed quickly, and eaten without ceremony. Animals contributed to diet. Chickens provided eggs. Sheep gave occasional milk or meat. Pigs were slaughtered seasonally, carefully preserved. Cows supplied milk. These resources were valuable. Consumption was deliberate. Waste minimized. Foraging supplemented diet when possible. Wild greens, nuts, berries, and herbs filled gaps. Knowledge of edible plants was practical. Mistakes were rare, usually minor, but caution guided behavior. Trade occasionally altered food variety. Salt, spices, or small luxuries could be purchased if surplus goods or coins were available. These were temporary enhancements, not everyday reality. And while that quietly carried on, hunger, satiation, and routine merged. Eating was functional, rhythmic, and predictable. Pleasure existed in small increments. Nutrition was constant, adaptation continuous. Preparation, consumption, and recovery formed an unbroken cycle. Meals were interwoven with labor, sleep, and care of home and animals. Food did not dominate life. It facilitated continuation of life. The peasant measured food not by flavor, but by endurance. Energy, utility, and survival were primary. Desire existed, but adaptation was constant. Patience was required. Satisfaction came from adequacy, not abundance. Chapter 16: clothing, repair, and the quiet art of preservation. Clothing in a medieval peasant's life was practical, durable, and repeatedly mended. Fashion was irrelevant. Garments existed to protect the body from weather, abrasion, and labor. Every piece served a function. Every tear demanded attention. Nothing was disposable. Garments were typically wool or linen. Wool provided warmth. Linen was lighter and cooler in summer. Layers were adjusted with seasons. Sleeves rolled, tunics folded, cloaks wrapped. Function guided choices. Comfort was relative, efficiency absolute. Children wore hand-me-downs. Clothes were patched repeatedly. Stitching was visible, intentional, and accepted. Durability mattered more than appearance. Threads frayed. New fabric was rare. Adaptation was constant. Shoes were basic. Leather, if affordable, often thin and hard-wearing. Feet were rarely protected beyond necessity. Cold, mud, and sharp stones were regular companions. Shoes were repaired or patched. Loss was inconvenient. Walking barefoot was occasional, practical, and accepted. Hats, hoods, and cloaks were common. Protection from sun, rain, and cold. They were functional, shared when needed, and adjusted constantly. Mending was a routine part of life. Every tear or worn edge was addressed. Needle and thread were tools as essential as a hoe or flail. Time spent repairing prevented larger losses. Patience mattered. Skill accumulated slowly. Clothing also reflected identity subtly. Gender, age, and occupation could be inferred. Beyond that, uniformity dominated. Differences were minimal because survival demanded focus on function, not decoration. Washing was infrequent. Dirt and soot accumulated gradually. Fabric durability mattered more than cleanliness. Clothing was aired when possible. Occasional scrubbing occurred. Winter made washing difficult. Seasons influenced garments. Winter required multiple layers. Summer required lighter clothing. Rain and wind dictated additional coverings. Adaptation was constant. Clothing was an extension of survival strategy. Footwear dictated mobility. Soft or worn soles slowed work. Broken shoes affected fields, travel, and daily tasks. Repair was essential. Knowledge of how to fix boots or shoes was practical, passed through generations. Contamination was an ever-present risk. Wells could be polluted by nearby animals or soil runoff. Streams carried sediments. Awareness guided collection and storage. Containers were cleaned when possible, though sometimes only superficially. Rainwater supplemented supply occasionally. Roof runoff, collected in barrels or cisterns, was used when convenient. Storage dictated distribution. Water was valuable, not infinite. Waste was avoided. Cooking and food preparation revolved around available water. Porridges, soups, and stews depended on it. Boiling water for cooking occurred routinely. Water for brewing weak ale or washing grain required similar attention. Animals consumed significant quantities. Cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens needed steady access. Daily routines included watering livestock. Failure to do so affected productivity and survival. Attention was continuous, though quiet. Season influenced water management. Summer demanded frequent collection. Winter sometimes froze supplies. Paths became slippery. Wells could be inaccessible. Adaptation was essential. Travel occasionally required fetching water from distant sources. Rivers, ponds, or neighboring wells became necessary when local supply diminished. These trips consumed time and energy, but were understood as routine. Children learned to handle water early. Buckets, pails, and small barrels became extensions of their work. Coordination, endurance, and timing were integrated lessons. Play occasionally intersected with these tasks, but function predominated. Storage and preservation of water mattered. Covered containers reduced contamination. Ice or debris was removed when possible. Careful handling prevented loss. Efficiency in collection and use was internalized. Illness and hydration were linked. Fever, diarrhea, or heat required additional attention. Water was functional medicine. Availability influenced survival quietly but significantly, and while that quietly carried on, water marked time. The rhythm of drawing, carrying, using, and replenishing blended with labor, meals, sleep, and social obligations. It punctuated daily life without drama or fanfare. No one celebrated abundance, nor dramatized scarcity. Water existed as a constant requirement, shaping routine, exertion, and endurance. The medieval peasant's relationship with water was neither leisurely nor careless. It was deliberate, habitual, and practical. Life adjusted naturally to its presence and limitations. Chapter 19: Light, Shadow, and the Measured Pace of Evening. The transition from day to night was subtle, gradual, and largely dictated by natural light. Peasants did not rely on artificial illumination beyond minimal fires or candles. Sunlight marked the beginning and end of work. Shadows lengthened quietly, signaling the slow shift from activity to rest. Evening was functional. The day's labor concluded. Animals were secured. Fields and tools were inspected. Fires were banked. Tasks were completed, not celebrated. The dimming light guided efficiency rather than leisure. Candles and small oil lamps were used sparingly. Wax and oil were valuable. Light was practical, not decorative. Flickering flames illuminated only essential spaces: a cooking area, a workbench, or a place to mend clothing. Darkness was largely accepted. Shadows grew across walls, floors, and objects. People adjusted posture and movement accordingly. Work slowed. Conversations decreased in volume. The environment itself dictated a natural pause. Meals were prepared and eaten quietly. Dinner mirrored breakfast and lunch in simplicity: bread, porridge, occasionally meat or cheese when available. Energy replenished without indulgence. The act of eating marked the day's functional closure rather than pleasure. Children observed, imitated, and participated in evening tasks. They learned patterns of movement, repetition, and timing. Preparation for sleep became implicit, linked with chores rather than ritual. Evening offered a minimal reprieve from labor. Work ceased gradually rather than abruptly. The rhythm of the day decelerated. Effort transitioned into observation and small maintenance tasks. Conversations were subdued. News, gossip, or instruction occurred at low volume. Loudness was unusual. Attention was selective. Fatigue and dim light discouraged extended speech. Communication was efficient, unembellished. The fire itself produced quiet noise, crackling logs, shifting embers. The soundscape complemented fading light. Movement was measured. Awareness of animals, tools, and other household members remained present. Preparation for night included practical adjustments: covering stored food, securing doors and gates, stacking firewood, and ensuring water was accessible. Every act was purposeful. Redundancy and care prevented minor crises. Silence was punctuated by ambient sounds: animals settling, wind outside, creaking wood, distant voices. These noises were neither alarming nor distracting. They blended into the expected rhythm of night. Sleep approached naturally. Bodies grew heavy. Eyes adjusted. Small tasks were completed before rest. Positioning for warmth, bedding arranged, and proximity to family or animals determined comfort and safety. And while that quietly carried on, the slow deceleration of evening mirrored the broader life pattern: labor, care, food, rest. Each component linked seamlessly to the next. The medieval peasant's night was predictable, unremarkable, and sufficient. It lacked dramatics. It lacked ceremony. Darkness itself was accepted as part of life's rhythm, a marker rather than an event. Through observation, repetition, and adaptation, people integrated light, shadow, and fatigue into their daily cycle. No instruction was needed. Knowledge passed quietly, embodied in routine and expectation. And in that unremarkable progression, the day concluded gently. Work paused. Firelight flickered. Animals rested. Humans rested. And the next cycle awaited, predictable and inevitable.